Right, so to any of you who haven't been to a Marxist discussion group before, just briefly explain how things work. Emily's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion where you'll bring up your questions and talk to each other for about 20 minutes, and then I'll bring them back at the end. So now, crisis in the Middle East.
Thank you. I prefer sitting down, but I think it's better to stand up so I can see all of you. Rosa Luxemburg once said that the choice before humanity today was socialism or barbarism. And Lenin actually said, more or less expressing the same idea, said that capitalism is horror without end. And I would say that nowhere is that more clear today than in the Middle East. We have the most barbaric scene. This area, which is the cradle of civilization, is today being dragged down in the most disgusting bloodbath and decay and the most, the complete decomposition of human relationships. Now, if you look at the bourgeois media, what is the idea that you get? Basically, the idea is put forward that this is something, suddenly that happened. Suddenly a group of well-armed men staged an uprising in Mosul, and the whole Iraqi army collapsed and melted away, and the Iraqi state split up in three, as if it came out of nowhere. And I think this really shows the complete lack of the ability of the bourgeoisie to understand the situation, and the complete blindness they have to the complete decay and dead end which they have actually reached historically. For Marxists, we view the situation in a different way. As dialectical materialists, we have a long view of history. We understand that in fact, development in history as well as in nature is not something that takes place gradually, step by step, but in fact that underlying currents can quantitatively rising contradictions over a period of time will always reflect themselves in a violent rupture with the state. And that is the situation. The situation that we see today unfolding rapidly in the Middle East, with not even 1 week being similar to the week before, is well, obviously never is, but with complete change of the situation from one week to another, is not the result of this or that arbitrary group or name or anything else, but in fact the result of decades of plundering, of raping, of violation of the whole of the region by imperialism and by the capitalist system, in fact. However, I would say that if we only look at, again, if we look at this situation in isolation, if we look at this ISIS or Islamic State or whatever you want to call it, and we look only at this situation in some parts of Syria and Iraq, we can get quite pessimistic conclusions. And also, I don't think we would understand the reality that's taking place. What we really need to take a look at is what is the real situation in the Middle East and what has been the main developments over the past period. And I would say for decades, ever since the Middle East was dragged into capitalism by the imperialists, mainly because of its natural resources, the Middle East has been a place where a tiny minority connected to imperialism, connected to the main oil industries and so on, has had an extremely lavish and luxurious life, whereas the vast majority of the population have been living in the worst, in the worst situation, poverty, unemployment, wars, and the most suffocating oppression. In fact, I would say the worst thing about living in the Middle East is not necessarily that you have to fight every day to stay alive, but it's the fact that you cannot breathe, because there's no freedom to breathe. You cannot express yourself. You cannot do what you want to do. There's no future to look forward to, and there's nothing progressive to build. And that is the main driving force, I would say, behind the developments that we see today in the region. And the first reaction to that was not ISIS, was not the situation that's taking place now, but what, in my opinion, was the Arab Spring, which started in Tunisia, because there was this, beginning with this Bouazizi, who burned himself, although he wasn't the first person to burn himself in Tunisia. Before that, there were dozens of people who've done the same thing throughout the region. But that was the last straw, we can say. And there was an social explosion, beginning with the youth, rebelling against these ills, which are essentially the ills of capitalism. Maybe the people there were not ready, were not conscious about this, and obviously there were no communist agitators or socialist agitators, really clever people to brainwash them. This is as people always claim, that revolutions, the bourgeois always claim that revolutions are the creations of communist agitators. There was none of that, but instinctively, these young people, rebelled against the oppression and the decay that capitalism really means, and this basically swept through the whole region. In fact, often we hear about, especially in these fine places that they call universities, very clever people always tell us about the strength of the state and the strength of the military machinery and the media propaganda and so on. But the fact was that without any plan, any arms, any organization, any leadership, the masses of Tunisia, within a matter of a few weeks, overthrew the Ben Ali dictatorship, which had been there for 30 years. And immediately afterwards, within a few weeks, you had the downfall of the Egyptian state, which was not just any state, but it was the second largest beneficiary of US military aid. This enormous state apparatus, hundreds of thousands of spies and intelligence officers who would entrench all areas, all pores of society basically, could not stand up to the unarmed will of the masses once they had decided to overthrow, not to overthrow the regime, but once they decided that they would not live another day in this situation. And that tells us something about the strength of the revolutionary movement. That once it's on the move, nothing can stop it. Yes. Now, at the same time, within these revolutions, I would say there was more than just there's more to it than just a movement in Tahrir Square. In fact, what we saw, which is something that again, there's a myth portraying that the Middle East is just everything in the Middle East is about religion, is about Islam, is about basically. I mean, the way that it's painted is that the Middle Eastern people are basically just people who want to live in a medieval society with no rights. They're against modern society, whatever that means. And religion is the overarching, the all-encompassing factor above all this. And this is something that they began especially to put forward after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, where this guy Samuel Huntington put forward his idea of the clash of civilizations, that this was a new driving force of history, basically in a slightly disguised way, putting forward a racist idea that from now on history would move forward between the clash of civilizations between mainly Western society and Eastern society, and in there, Islamic societies being one of the main things. However, I would say that the Arab Revolution disproved this completely, because what we saw during the Arab Revolution was, on the one hand, you had the Arab dictators who were Muslims, at least in words, of all kinds, and hand in hand with American imperialism, with Western imperialism, with European imperialism, all the so-called democratic leaders of Europe and the US, with Barack Obama also one of them, because he was completely mum throughout the whole thing, basically supporting these dictators and being completely hypocritical about the so-called democracy that they always call for. And also in Israel, we saw that Netanyahu was completely behind, was very afraid of the fall of any of these dictatorships, which for him was a sign of stability, some people that he could deal with. That was on the one hand. You had the ruling classes basically of all the world, and on the other hand, you had within the Arab world, you had the masses of the Arab world, whether they were Muslim or Christian or anything else. In fact, I mean, you could see that in Tahrir Square, you all saw the scenes where Muslims were praying, and then the Christians were making a chain around them to defend them against thugs and lumpen elements. And at this, not only this, but you had at the same time millions of people in the West. I remember, I mean, I'm not an Arab, I'm an Iranian, so you know it's a bit different than the rest of the Middle East. But I was watching Al Jazeera day and night, and so all my friends, people who had not been political ever before, was following the situation minute by minute, and basically cheering on the revolution, on the revolutionary movement of the Arab mass. And that shows, you know, that in the final analysis, and when once society enters a crisis, the most important thing is the question of class. The question of which interests in the economy do you represent? Do you represent the rich, the elite, the oppressors, or do you represent the workers and the youth, the dispossessed and the oppressed? At the same time, we also saw that the immense movement of the working class. In fact, in Tunisia, it was the movement of the. In Tunisia, it was a movement of the workers of the developing general strike in different regions that overthrew the Ben Ali dictatorship, which happened in the last days of the revolution. And in Egypt as well, actually the revolution had stalled at one point, and it was only once the working class started coming in with the developing general strike that the army generals basically and the ruling class said we cannot afford this, and we need to take down Mubarak in order not to change the regime, but in order to prevent the collapse of the whole of Egyptian capitalism in effect. So that shows also the strength of the working class. Once it begins to move, that it can pull all of society to a halt. But I would say the most important development during the revolution was the question of power, which was posed in more ways than one. In fact, we saw everywhere throughout, in all countries where there was mass movements, we saw councils, people's assemblies, and different institutions basically being developed by the revolutionary masses themselves in the factories, in the neighborhoods, in the areas, in the regions, where normal people, like yourselves or your parents and so on, would develop would participate in the running of society. I would say probably in Tunisia this was the most developed. In several regions, the councils voted to take power altogether until there was a new government. But they were present everywhere also in the Egyptian revolution. And the significance of this is this, that the state that is there today is a capitalist state, is a bourgeois state, essentially developed to subjugate the majority of the people and to allow them to be exploited by the bourgeoisie, allow profit to be extracted from the work, essentially. However, these councils we could call them the embryos of what could have been a future worker state. This could have been institutions through which the revolutionary masses could assert power themselves. But I would say that the main problem was that in spite of all of this happening without any theory or knowledge, prior knowledge or plan by the masses, which shows the enormous strength of the movement, there was not enough, and the masses did not realize that in order what needed to be done was to take power themselves. They didn't realize that the essential problem, all the things that they were fighting against, unemployment, poverty, the lack of democracy, these things were, completely tied up to the capitalist system. And the way to overcome this was to take power themselves through their own councils, connect them on a national scale and take power, and also to take economic power, which is the most important source of power in society. So to nationalize the industry and the main banks which are there, and which are still controlled by the same people who ruled the countries before. So de facto, although they removed the heads of state, they removed the head of the dragon, the body still remained, and no matter who would come up to replace that, the main levers of power were still in the hands of the ruling class. And that was a shortcoming of the revolution, that it did not have a leadership that realized what needed to be done, like take the revolution to its logical conclusion. And thus they passed power back to one or another part of the ruling class. In Egypt, first it was Tantawi, who was a general, who was from the same family, we can say, as Mubarak, although he was pushed out by mass movements which developed immediately afterwards. Then you had the rise of power of Morsi, and immediately afterwards we saw again, oh, there we go, you see, this is what they always wanted, and this is what the Arabs wanted. But Morsi didn't represent anything but, again, another layer of another part of the Egyptian bourgeoisie who had been pushed out and isolated for a period. And in fact, the role that the Muslim Brotherhood had always played, which was the reason why they were allowed to exist, in fact, because they were tolerated for decades. And especially the last 20 years or 15 years of the Mubarak dictatorship, they were fertilized as a last frontier for Egyptian capitalism. This was a loyal opposition, basically. Someone was allowed to be in opposition, officially illegal, so they would channel and attract all opposition voices, but who would not break with the system essentially once they took power. And this was exactly the role that they played, to save the system. However, they could not feed the Egyptian masses. Some guy told me, Muslims can fast for a month, but they can't fast for a year. And that's exactly the truth. You can sell so much, by telling people that, bow your head, and then in the next world you'll be better. Do your work, accept what's coming to you. In the end, what Morsi couldn't do, that he could not feed, he could not clothe, he could not give people in Egypt housing, electricity, stability, or any sense that there was actually a future to be built. He basically continued the same as before. And that's why we saw 17 million people coming out in the second revolution against Morsi, which was on a far higher level, but essentially it did the same thing. It made the same mistake of just bringing back another faction of the ruling class. And that's why, we can discuss about the Arab Revolution a lot more, but obviously that's not the main focus of this thing. But it's just to say that obviously after several years of constant mobilizations and struggles, you saw an ebb in the movement, basically. The masses, I wouldn't say they were defeated in any way, because if you go to Egypt today, no one is tired of a revolution, and no one would take anything, from anyone really. They would not take it, especially the Egyptian workers would not allow themselves to be dominated and oppressed the same way. And Sisi has not defeated them either. But people are saying, well, this is not working. You can't just go out on the streets, overthrow someone, have a general strike, have whatever. And then some similar person would come up. Although I would say Morsi's first prime minister, Sisi's first prime minister was also overthrown by a mass movement. Although it wasn't as big as the other ones. So I would say because of this situation, you had an ebb in the movement. And people are people are tired, first of all, but people also want to, if they want to move, they want to move differently. They want to have something else. They want to shift things in a deeper way, and that's something I think a lot of Arabs are actually saying right now. In Syria, the Syrian revolution developed a bit differently, because in Syria the situation was different from Egypt, for instance, which has had a long period with privatizations, liberalizations, and basically the state and the ruling class had no legitimacy left. But in Syria, the situation was different, because in Syria, in the 60s, in the late 60s, because of peculiar situations, there was a revolution which was led by basically the armed, an officer caste. And through a peculiar situation, they ended up nationalizing the whole economy, basically expropriating the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and implementing something modeled on the Soviet Union, a deformed worker state, we could say, where there's no democracy, complete lack of all of it. But because of the planned economy, they were able to raise living standards relatively compared to the rest of the region, to give people more stability in their lives. The cultural level was higher, there was no real unemployment. And although Bashar al-Assad had tried to take back these gains, since the 90s, has been opening up, and there's been talk about the Chinese model, which is basically going towards capitalism. This has not been implemented in full force, and especially in the cities, there was still a level of stability amongst the working class. And I would say when the revolution started, it started in the east, which was the places mostly hit by privatizations. Where there was a drought and there was 1 million people being displaced. And obviously a lot of people were angry, but Bashar was intelligent enough to keep the city people and the workers, more or less happy, although they weren't happy with the lack of democracy, obviously. But once the revolution started, you saw it immediately picking up it didn't pick up in the beginning, but once it picked up, it was mainly in the east. But it struggled to gain a foothold within the cities and the working class. In fact, there was no real strikes in Egypt taking place. The strikes that were reported were strikes of merchants, so basically, middle class strikes, but no real worker strikes as such during the revolution. Because a lot of Syrian workers were saying, well, you want democracy, you want U.S. intervention, and you want them to implement democracy. What kind of democracy is the U.S. going to bring us? Democracy like in Iraq? Democracy like in Afghanistan? Or at best, like democracy like they have in Turkey, which is no real democracy. So I think a lot of people, and at the same time, with the cost of what? Privatizations, unemployment, all of these things that they know were going to happen. And people were not interested, not that they weren't sympathetic to the democratic ideas, but I think a lot of workers were just did not want to support any side. And that meant that the revolution stalled to a halt. And in fact, the program in a revolution is the most important thing, because obviously a revolution, as Marxists were not pacifists, but a revolution is always weaker than the state when it comes to an armed conflict. Obviously, you don't have a general staff. You don't have educated people in the tactics of war. You don't have like military exercises, which is consolidated the workings of the army for years and years. You don't have modern equipment. At best, you have like a bit more than lightweight guns and so on. So obviously, you're in a much weaker position. But that's not the point. In a revolutionary situation, the program is the best weapon, and the armed struggle is only auxiliary. Like, during the Russian Revolution, 21 armies attacked the Bolsheviks, who had literally 1 gun per 2 soldiers. So once the first one died, then the second one would continue fighting. But how did they win the civil war? It was by going to the soldiers on the other side and saying, "We're your brothers and sisters. We don't want to fight against you. Turn your arms against your own ruling classes, and we'll help you, and we'll build a socialist federation, a world socialist federation, where there's no struggles between the nations." And that's how they won in extremely backward conditions, with a high level of isolation. And that's how they won the civil war, basically. But the Syrian revolution did not do that. And by not doing this, it's ground to a halt. And then as tiring started setting in, obviously with the military part of the revolution gaining the upper hand, then it was also easier for reactionary forces like the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, the Jordanis, and the Americans to get a foothold in, because people are fighting, they're dying. So it's quite easy to say, well, we got some guns, you need arms, you can have it. They're in a desperate situation. You have to do this and this and this. And that meant that they could put in they could gain a foothold and started pushing the revolution towards, not away from a class position and towards a sectarian position. The revolution started with calling, "We're all Syrians," and ended by calling, today, where do you hear that? Not all Syrians. It's all about, Allahu Akbar or this or that other religious thing. Not that we're against religion per se, but the point is that they moved it away, divided up Syrian society and pushed it on a nationalist or a sectarian character, and that did not weaken Assad in any way whatsoever. In fact, that strengthened Assad, Because democracy was something that people in the Western Syria could relate to. If it were combined with the social demands of nationalization, of workers' control, workers' democracy, they could have gained a foothold. But by putting it off towards a sectarian civil war, then what would a Christian think? You know, in that situation, no Christian or Alawite would see themselves as safe. And in fact, I would say the proof of this was shown in May or June, was it when there was elections, so-called elections in Syria. Obviously, it's sham elections. There's no real opposition allowed to stand. But there was mass participation. In Lebanon, there was 100,000 people going to the Syrian embassy to vote. This doesn't show that people are in favor of Assad. It shows that they would not have the barbarism and the situation that they see. They would rather have extreme oppression than that, and then the whole all of society and the culture basically falling together, and barbarism prevailing. And that was pushed by who? By the U.S. imperialism and their allies in the Gulf states, in Turkey and in Jordan. The most reactionary forces on this planet were behind that thing. And you know, it's funny because they talk today. It's like, oh, they talk about the barbarism of ISIS and you know, decapitation. As long as they were decapitating Syrians, they were freedom fighters. You know, in the media, they were portrayed as revolutionary freedom fighters, fighting against oppression, fighting against all of this. But today, suddenly, because now they've become out of control, they become a threat to themselves. And billions of dollars were funded into the sectarianism. And you know, some people say, well, the U.S. didn't support ISIS directly, although I have my doubts about that. But it doesn't matter, because by whipping up this sectarianism, by putting it in that is the logical conclusion of it. All other groups were, first of all, supported and funded by the Americans and the CIA, as well as probably ISIS, and all their allies. You know, they were trained in Jordan and Turkey, some of them in Qatar, and all of them got funds, logistical help, all kinds of support from this. Why? In order to cut through the Arab Revolution, and in order to basically, because of their own games in the region against, you know, because they had their own internal competition with Iran and with Syria and so on. And again, although the hypocrisy didn't end there, because then they weren't really prepared to do anything. You know, then they started bombing. They weren't really prepared to do anything once ISIS attacked Kobane. You know, you had this situation a few weeks ago developing with these desperate people. Actually, the Kurds being the only people who had fought against ISIS successfully. Why? Because they were defending something that they believed in. They were defending a democratic system which was non-sectarian, anyone could participate, and it was far more progressive than anything else in the region. And that's why they would fight till the end. You know, that's why the Maliki's army in Iraq didn't want to fight, because they didn't have anything to defend. But these people were defending their own homes. And what did the imperialists do? The Turks cut the border, not allowing the PKK to send in troops to help, not allowing anyone to send arms or money or anything else. Although they kept the channel open to send supplies to ISIS from Turkey. They allowed ISIS to recruit from Turkey. The Americans, you know, obviously they were against ISIS officially, but they weren't really hitting anything. I read some reports saying, well, you know, they're bombing, but they're not hitting the tanks and the heavy artillery that they have there. So they basically bled them out, and now they're letting the Peshmerga in, which is supposedly, a progressive Iraqi force. But the Peshmerga is a far right-wing, feudal wing of the Kurdish movement. And the Peshmerga have been trying to crush the Syrian part of Kurdistan for ever since they gained autonomy a few years ago. They haven't been allowed to, because people were against them, first of all. And the PKK has said, well, you know, you can participate in our democratic structures, but you're not allowed to carry arms. Well, now that's finished, because now they need their help. And it's basically, I would say, it's the beginning of an invasion of Syrian Kurdistan by the Iraqi Kurds. So that's the whole, again, the whole hypocrisy of U.S. imperialism has been, and the so-called coalition has been completely exposed. that in fact the imperialists and the Islamists have no different, they're two sides of the same coin. In fact, the Islamic fundamentalists could not have survived a single day with billions of dollars being channeled into them by the imperialists and their allies in the region. Yes, and I think everybody is beginning to see this. I think a lot of normal people, I just don't know what to do anymore. I cannot believe anything. Then there's the question of Iraq. Barack Obama was very sentimental when he declared, "Oh, we must fight barbarism in Iraq" and so on. I would say that how many people have ISIS killed? Let's say they've killed 10,000 people. Let's say they've killed 50,000 people. How many hundreds of thousands of people were not killed by the U.S. occupation of Iraq? That's barbarism. I mean, that was directly. And then what did the Americans do? They attacked the power grid, the water supply, all the basic functionings of society was completely destroyed by the Americans. Millions of people have in fact been killed because of the American occupation and now the 3 wars that they fought against the country. That's barbarism. And in fact, the whole Iraq, you can say a lot of things about Saddam Hussein, and we're not defending him. Saddam was a brutal dictator, but there was no sectarianism as such in Iraq at that time. Saddam he oppressed certain parts of the country, especially the Shia parts, and he also oppressed the Kurds. And that was obviously we're completely against that. But still, there was not sectarianism as a cultural phenomenon amongst the majority, as a dominating trend within Iraq. That was again introduced by who? By the Americans. Why? Because after the occupation, they not only took down Saddam, they also took out his whole state apparatus. So in order to dominate the country, in order to oppress the revolutionary resistance movement that in fact started, they had to lean on different sectarian elements of Shia sectarians, of Sunni sectarians, and every attempt they made, the Iraqis made to form cross-sectarian movements, and there were several attempts, not necessarily the leftist one, even bourgeois ones. Every attempt they made was sabotaged by the Americans and the stooges in Baghdad. And Maliki that they put in, suddenly Maliki is not very popular with the Americans. He was a gangster, and he's always been a gangster. I mean, he's just a thug, He's just like some guy you find off the streets and give him a suit. And that's exactly what he is. And the way that he ruled Iraq was not through any kind of, democracy, George Bush used to say, but just through horror. And also, I mean, he used sectarianism not even because I would say he's probably not even a Shia, like a practicing Shia, but just because it's easier way to do. Well, someone owes him money in a Sunni part of the country. He releases some Shia gang to go ravage the whole area, rape some people, and kill whoever is the opponent of Maliki. That was the type of rule that Maliki introduced. At one stage when he felt threatened by cross-sectarian currents, he whipped out Shia sectarianism. He even sentenced his vice president to death. I mean, that's the kind of people that the Americans put in there. And suddenly, because everybody can see this now and they're a bit embarrassed, they have to distance themselves from him. But that's the guy they put in. And I would say that Maliki was a compromise between the Americans and their enemy, the Iranians. And I would say the reason why they put him there was because he was probably the most corrupt person they could find. Because they could bribe him, and they could work with him, and they could find a deal about anything. And that is how the U.S. Ruled Iraq by sectarianism, by making all the state institutions in Iraq being sectarian based. The president has to be a Kurd, the prime minister has to be a Shia, the speaker of parliament who has no power basically, it has to be a Sunni. And all institutions, all political development were pushed into these molds, which is completely foreign to the Arabs. I mean, the Arab world is one nation, really speaking, stretching from, there are differences, but stretching from Iraq to Morocco is the same as one nation with different dialects, we can say, or with different regional peculiarities. But the Americans and imperialism, well, throughout the last 100 years, tried to split this thing up and whip up this sectarianism in order to rule and dominate the region. And also, what's the social situation that they created in Iraq? Unemployment. I mean, this is the case throughout the Middle East, but especially I would say probably in Iraq more than anywhere. You have this layer of the youth which have nothing to look forward to, which are unemployed and cannot really hope for any kind of employment, which just wanders from one cafe or street corner to another, living in absolute desperation, and it's basically, cigarettes and tea. That's all the life is up. Your breakfast is cigarettes and tea. Your lunch is cigarettes. Am I right? Am I right? I mean, if anyone here lives in the region, they would know. And there's this completely dispossessed, declassed youth who have nothing to look forward to. And this is the layer that joins ISIS. Why? Because finally they think that there's something to fight for. Obviously, the majority of this layer also fights for the revolution. But some of them join these kinds of outfits. Housing in Iraq, there's desperate needs for 1 million new houses or flats, where there's only 25,000 being built per year. Water, electricity, all of these things work far below half of capacity, mainly because the Americans destroyed the whole of the infrastructure. 22% of children growth is stunted because of chronic malnutrition. That's the situation that they created it. And once the Arab Revolution broke out, there was also movements in Iraq. How did Maliki, and that was when the occupation was still going on, at least for a couple of months. How did Maliki act against the democratic, peaceful demonstrators? By shooting them down, by arresting them, by illegalizing them, by oppressing them. That's what American imperialism means in the Middle East. However, over a period, I would say that the Arab Revolution, it was simmering. The movements were not completely suppressed in Iraq, and there was a simmering revolt throughout 2011, 12, and 13. Finally, in the end of 2013, there was a huge movement, especially in the Anbar province. Although this movement originally was throughout Iraq, but mainly in the Sunni areas. And you had in Fallujah, I think it was 100,000 people camping for 2 months in the city squares, basically occupying the city center. And what kind of a movement was this? I remember there was a lot of talk about the Saudis and Qatar, the Gulf states, basically giving money to a lot of tribal leaders to bring food to the movement, to kind of bribe them, basically. And there was a lot of discussion about this, but there was one guy I read an interview with, and he was saying some interesting things. He said, look, everyone wants to get a foot inside, but we have nothing to do with any of them. All the politicians, all the rulers, the whole establishment, they're all corrupt. And we're not sectarian based. What we want is jobs and fight against inflation and an end of corruption. That was the real movement. How did Maliki react to this? He bombed Fallujah for 2 months. I mean, this is what else can you get? He said, Al Qaeda is operating. Probably Al Qaeda had a few hundred people there, but they didn't have any foothold within the hundreds of thousands of people fighting. But I would say after that, probably a lot of people just say, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between being bombed indiscriminately, a city of 500,000 people being bombed indiscriminately for weeks, and then having Al Qaeda ruling, whatever that could bring. There's no difference. It was hell. It was hell on earth. And I would say that was when the situation changed. And the anger towards the Iraqi army especially, which is a mainly Shia-dominated army, and seen as an occupying force, the anger burst to the fore. And they were pushed out a lot of places. They could not hold the whole of the Anbar province, basically. They fizzled out, and they had to withdraw. And that's also the basis of the whole situation in Mosul, where you had an uprising, clearly led by, probably the strongest force, although not the majority, I would say, of this uprising was formed by ISIS people. and other Islamist organizations, other tribal-based, other like nationalist, ex-Ba'athist movements and so on, who stepped into this vacuum of the state basically withdrawing. Yeah, they had a few hundred people rising up, but I think also the reasons for why the army in Mosul, the 30,000 strong, is a lot more than 800 people. The reason why they withdrew was because they were afraid of what the people would say, because people would just had enough of this. And basically there was an element of an uprising in that thing. And also, what did the Iraqi soldiers have to defend? I mean, they weren't fed, they weren't clothed, the arms were out of date. What did they have to? And they had to defend Maliki and that corrupt government, which no one believes in. Obviously, they had nothing to fight for, and they disappeared. And that is the situation. That is the beginning of the situation you had in Iraq, where there's, I would say, like basically a wild west developing, an area which no one really controls. And all of this, in my opinion, could be traced back to the interventions of imperialism and the West in the whole of the region. And also, I would say, during the Iraq War, they overthrew they dismantled the Iraqi state and also the Iraqi army, which meant that the other large army in the region, the Iranian army, was left completely unchecked. Sorry. And that changed the whole balance of forces in the region between the different nations. And you had the Saudis and the Gulf states feeling extremely threatened because they're basically hanging by a thread, having no legitimacy, nothing to justify the corrupt rule of a kingdom, basically defending Mecca, which is like a Muslim thing, and why have kings? Obviously, it doesn't really fit together. An extremely corrupt and particularly rotten clique. And they were very afraid of what could happen because they could not, if the Iranian army was allowed to basically rule. So that's why they started stepping up the proxy wars, arming different proxy groups of all kinds of things, Islamists mainly, who are also a threat to themselves actually if they come back to Saudi Arabia, but rather have them abroad than at home. And again, whipping up the sectarian side of the equation. And also, well, just to end, I would say this is the situation is clear. This whole mess is caused by capitalism, by imperialism. And the U.S. intervention today, the Western intervention, is not going to solve anything. Because what are they building? In Syria, they're building the moderate forces. Who are the moderate forces? Now they talk about Jabhat al-Nusra as a moderate force. They wanted to fuse, they were going to fuse with ISIS 1 year ago, a year and a half ago. So how can, what does that mean, moderate force? There's the Hazm, is it? Harakat al-Zaman al-Muhammad, right? Which means the movement of the time of Muhammad. Is that a non-sectarian foot? Basically, they want to rule Syria, they want to dominate Syria by whipping up more sectarianism, but just sectarianists that they can control more, basically, Islamists that don't really follow through to what they decided and who they can deal with. And in Iran, in Iraq, the only thing they had to lean on is the Shia militias, who are completely backed by Iran, which is now de facto the closest ally in the region. But what do the Shia militias do? I saw this interview with some of them. They said, oh look, they showed some journalists, there's like a body of 9 ISIS men hanging from a tree. And then they visited the village from where these bodies came from, and they interviewed people and said, well, they're not ISIS people. They attacked, the ISIS guys fled, and they didn't have anything to go back and show their own. So they just kidnapped some random people and killed them. Just more sectarianism. And that is what American imperialism is basing itself on. So that's obviously not going to solve anything. And also now they want to split up the Iraqi army into regional armies. So basically giving every governor his own army. Which is just a recipe for even more disaster, fragmentation, and it's not going to solve anything. Sectarianism has always been completely tied up to imperialists who started off, it goes back to the First World War where the Middle East, the Arab nation, which is, as I said, one nation, essentially, was split up and completely artificially You see these straight lines, you know, between Iraq and Syria. Egypt is the only country in the world which has a bottom left corner, you know, completely artificial lines. And they were designed to what? To get different groups of nationalities and sects and so on in, to play them up, to whip them up, play them out against each other in order to dominate the situation. Now, although in a deep crisis of capitalism on a world scale, this is blowing up in the faces of imperialism, and it's blowing up to an uncontrollable level that they cannot control. You know, so that they cannot tolerate. They have to do something, but again, everything they do it just makes the situation worse. Capitalism cannot solve this situation in the Middle East. And I think it's quite clear from what I tried to explain that you have the crisis of capitalism, but it's not just, you know, you see, it's producing two different trends. On the one hand, you have the barbarism, the bloodbath, the decay, the backwardness that these animals really represent in Iraq and Syria. And on the other hand, you have the Arab revolutions, which in it carries the germ of socialism, which is not, you know, a specific idea, but it's you know, like an ideology put into the minds of the masses. But it's just the acknowledgement of the fact that in this region there are the natural resources, the human resources, and the demand, and all the possibilities to solve all the main problems of housing, of poverty, of malnutrition, of hunger, all of this. Everything is there. There's plenty of resources, but it's not been put together because the bourgeoisie, the imperialists, cannot profit from it individually. So the only way to solve all these problems is for the masses of the Middle East to take power in their own hands. And the Arab revolutions, in my opinion, is a first step towards that, although it's still in an unconscious phase, we can see. And this whole question of Islamic fundamentalism, you see, I would say that it has nothing to do with the masses of the Middle East, who are traditionally Islamic people, Muslims. It has nothing to do with them, and in fact, it has never survived a single day without the active support of imperialism. It was built by them, firstly in the 50s against Nasser in Egypt, in Afghanistan against the Soviets, against the Afghan revolution, and now we see in Iraq and Syria is in a similar way. They built it up as a bulwark against revolution, against the will of the masses, against communism, against socialism, which is in fact the real traditions of the Middle East. If you go back, the only mass movements that have actually been, and the first mass movements to arrive in the Middle East were always either communist, left-wing nationalist, socialist, or some kind of a leftist movement. You had Nasser in Egypt, who was a very peculiar, contradictory figure, but he had left-wing leanings. He wanted to nationalize the whole economy. In Syria, we had the same situation. The Iraqi Communist Party had millions of members. In Sudan, you had the same situation. Lebanese Communist Party, the Iranian Communist Party, the Turkish Communist Party. And the national movements that were also present in all these countries were very, very left-wing, talked about nationalizations, talked about a fight against imperialism, and so on. The fight against imperialism that the Islamists talk about is completely hollow. It's only words, it carries nothing. But the real traditions that the Arab masses have and the Middle Eastern masses have is the traditions of socialism. And I would say in the next period, we will see the revival of these things because the masses are looking for a way out. Although I would say probably in Syria and Iraq, the perspective has been postponed for a period. But there's big developments being prepared in Egypt when nothing is solved. In Iran, where there's big contradictions just waiting to explode. There was a big movement in 2009, but it was kind of quelled down but not crushed. And in Turkey, where we've seen the first explosions during the Gezi Park demos, but Turkish society is on the edge of an explosion. I would say it's ripe for revolution. And that would again completely change the situation in the rest of the region. Thank you very much.